The man collapsed to his knees before the granite headstone as if the earth had suddenly given way beneath him, his breath breaking into ragged, helpless sobs while his small daughter stood frozen behind him, clutching the sleeve of her red coat and staring at the carved name she barely remembered. Morning fog clung to the cemetery like a held breath, pale sunlight slicing through bare branches, and in that quiet daylight grief sounded unbearably loud as a single father finally let himself fall apart at his wife's grave. If you're watching Kind Soul Narratives and you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances even in the darkest moments, take a second right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach hearts that need them. Caleb Rowan had not planned to cry that day, not the way he did, shaking so hard his gloved hands pressed into the cold grass as though he might disappear into it. He had promised himself he would stay strong for Mira, that he would be the steady parent she needed, the one who didn't crumble every time the world reminded him of what it had taken away. But the date carved into the stone was impossible to ignore, the anniversary arriving with brutal punctuality, and the silence around him felt like an accusation. The headstone was simple because simple was all he could afford, gray and unadorned, and yet it carried the weight of everything he had lost when Arwen died in a sudden accident that turned ordinary life into a long, exhausting survival test. The grass was damp, the air smelled faintly of earth and old leaves, and the sky above was pale blue in that cruel way that suggested the world had moved on without him. Caleb's life had narrowed since that day 2 years ago. He worked nights stocking shelves at a warehouse that buzzed with fluorescent lights and conveyor belts, coming home before dawn to pack lunches and braid Myra's hair with clumsy patience. Bills arrived faster than paychecks, and every unexpected expense felt like a small emergency. He loved his daughter with a ferocity that surprised him, but love did not make exhaustion disappear, and grief had a way of resurfacing when he least expected it. Standing there now, tears streaking his windburned face, he felt the familiar mix of guilt and longing. He had survived while Arwen had not, and some days that fact alone felt like a failure. Mira stepped closer, her gray gloves brushing his coat as she placed one small hand on his shoulder the way she had seen adults do. Her eyes were serious, too old for her age, and she watched him with quiet concern. She remembered her mother only in fragments, the smell of soap, a laugh that echoed in memory like a song whose lyrics were gone. The cemetery stretched around them in neat rows, a place of order that did nothing to contain the chaos inside Caleb's chest. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to the stone, letting the cold seep into his skin as if it might numb the ache. That was when a shadow crossed the headstone, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Caleb looked up, blinking through tears, and saw a woman standing a respectful distance away, holding a bouquet of white lilies so fresh they seemed to glow against her dark coat. She was poised in a way that suggested confidence, but there was nothing hurried or intrusive about her presence. The woman's hair was pinned neatly back, her expression thoughtful rather than curious, as if she were carrying her own invisible weight. She waited, allowing the moment to belong to them, the fog curling around her ankles like a quiet audience. Her name was Celine Hartwell, though Caleb had no way of knowing that then, nor that she was one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country, a billionaire whose name appeared in financial headlines and philanthropic reports. To the world, Celine was known for decisive leadership and innovation. To herself, she was someone who understood loss too intimately. Years earlier, she had stood in a different cemetery under similar daylight, burying her younger sister after a sudden illness shattered their family. Wealth had not insulated her from grief, it had only made the loneliness quieter and more profound. Celine stepped forward and knelt, placing the lilies carefully at the base of the headstone. The petals caught the light, stark and beautiful against the stone. She did not look at Caleb as she did it, her attention fixed on the name carved there, and for a moment the world narrowed to the shared gravity of remembrance. When she finally straightened, her eyes met his with a softness that disarmed him. There was no pity in her gaze, only recognition, and that alone made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Caleb felt exposed, his grief laid bare in front of a stranger, but something about her presence steadied him. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of lilies and damp earth, and Mira watched the woman with quiet curiosity. Celine's eyes flicked briefly to the child, lingering there with an expression that hinted at understanding beyond words. She had never had children of her own, but she recognized the way responsibility sat heavy on Caleb's shoulders, how his posture bent not just under sorrow but under the daily strain of holding a life together for someone else. They parted without ceremony, Celine walking away along the gravel path while Caleb gathered himself, wiping his face and helping Mira adjust her gloves. Yet the moment refused to fade as easily as others had. That evening, Caleb returned to his small apartment, the walls thin and the heat unreliable, and found a simple envelope slipped under the door. There was no return address, only his name written in careful script. Inside was a handwritten note, brief and understated, expressing sympathy and a quiet offer of help if he ever needed it, followed by a card embossed with a discreet logo he vaguely recognized from news stories he half-listened to during late-night shifts. Confusion gave way to disbelief as Caleb searched the name online after Mira fell asleep. Celine Hartwell's face appeared on the screen, polished and composed, attached to articles about startups, acquisitions, and charitable foundations. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a mistake, some coincidence that would evaporate if he looked too closely. But the lilies at the grave had been real, their image vivid in his mind, and the note's sincerity felt impossible to ignore. The days that followed tested him. Pride warred with desperation as overdue notices piled up, the warehouse cut hours, and Mira came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip he could not afford. Caleb found himself thinking about the card more than he wanted to admit, about Celine's steady gaze and the unspoken promise it carried. Eventually, with hands trembling, he reached out, expecting nothing and fearing disappointment. What unfolded changed everything, not in a sudden, fantastical sweep, but in a series of grounded, humane gestures that felt almost unreal in their kindness. Celine did not appear with cameras or grand announcements. Instead, she listened. She learned about Arwen, about Myra's love of drawing, about the exhaustion that came from trying to be both parents at once. She offered practical help first, arranging stable daytime work through one of her companies, work that respected Caleb's need to be present for his daughter. She quietly covered medical bills that had been haunting him since Arwen's accident, lifting a weight he had learned to carry with clenched teeth. The transformation was not immediate, and it was not without its own emotional challenges. Caleb grappled with guilt, with the fear that accepting help somehow diminished his worth. Celine, in her own way, wrestled with boundaries, determined not to replace grief with dependency. What connected them was an understanding that dignity mattered as much as assistance. Daylight scenes replaced the gray haze that had dominated Caleb's world, mornings walking Mira to school under clearer skies, afternoons spent learning a new role at work, evenings that ended with less anxiety and more quiet gratitude. As months passed, the cemetery visit that had begun it all took on a new meaning. Caleb returned with Mira on warm afternoons, the lilies long gone but their memory alive. He spoke silently to Arwen about the unexpected ways life could still surprise him, about the woman who had knelt beside her grave and, in doing so, had reminded him that compassion could come from the most unlikely places. Celine continued her own visits, honoring her sister, finding in these shared spaces a measure of peace she had thought unreachable. If this story has touched your heart, please support it in whatever way feels right to you. Your encouragement keeps these moments of humanity alive and shared. Before the final moments of this story, take a second to comment and share what this journey made you feel. On a bright, clear morning much like the first but gentler in its light, Caleb stood once more before the headstone, Mira beside him, her laughter carrying softly as she chased a butterfly along the path. The weight in his chest was still there, a permanent mark of love and loss, but it no longer crushed him. Celine stood a short distance away, hands folded, not as a savior or a spectacle, but as someone who had chosen to meet grief with grace. In that quiet place, surrounded by stones that told stories of endings, Caleb understood that life could be reshaped by a single act of compassion. The world had not become perfect, and sorrow had not vanished, but hope had taken root in the most unexpected soil, proving that even at a grave, new beginnings could quietly, profoundly grow.